US President Donald Trump has announced that his so-called Board of Peace for Gaza is now taking applications for membership. That's the organisation whose creation was actually backed by the UN Security Council when it came to the ceasefire in Gaza, which will supposedly oversee the reconstruction and economic recovery of the Gaza Strip. Now, so far, 60 countries have been invited to join, represented by their leaders. Some of the names on the list might be surprising. So Russian President Vladimir Putin has been invited to join, despite currently waging an illegal war in Ukraine. Also on the guest list is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the man who's the cause of Gaza needing reconstruction in the first place, and the person who doesn't want to see it reconstructed because he would prefer them all to leave. We're yet to hear if Putin or Bibi have accepted those invites. Hungary's Viktor Orban, though, is in. He posted this on X. With President real Donald Trump comes peace. Another letter has arrived. Hungary's efforts for peace are being recognised. President Trump has invited Hungary to join the work of the Board of Peace as a founding member. We have, of course, accepted this honourable invitation. Canada's Mark Carney has also agreed to join in principle. Most member states will serve terms of just 3 years. But this is very Trumpian. There is an upgrade available. So for just $1 billion, a member can become permanent. It's not exactly clear where that money would go. It's a pretty hefty price tag for joining an organisation when no one really seems to understand what it's for. So the charter forming the board doesn't even mention Gaza, and instead suggests that the organisation is intended to operate like the UN, mediating in other conflicts. In an interview with Reuters last week, Trump said the board would start with Gaza's reconstruction before moving on to other conflicts. But this is how the board words its mission. The Board of Peace is an international organisation that seeks to promote stability, restore dependable and lawful governance, and secure enduring peace in areas affected or threatened by conflict. One diplomat told Reuters that the new Board of Peace is, quote, a Trump United Nations that ignores the fundamentals of the UN Charter. And three Western leaders told the press agency it looked like an attempt to undermine the UN. The Board of Peace doesn't just have member states, it also has an executive made up of individuals. Trump, as you would imagine, is its president. He announced that last year. Last week, he briefed the rest of that team. So they include Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as well as property developers Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Witkoff is also Trump's special envoy, while Kushner, of course, is married to his daughter Ivanka. Other members include Mark Rowan. He's the billionaire CEO of investment firm Apollo Global Management, who was nominated by Trump for US Treasury Secretary in 2024 after giving the president a $1 million donation towards his 2020 campaign. He's joined by Nikolai Mladenov, who Trump recently appointed as the United States High Representative for Gaza, a career diplomat. He was formerly the UN's Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. So he's perhaps the most plausible member of this ultimately incredibly distasteful group. And speaking of distaste, also joining the executive team is Tony Blair, Britain's foremost expert on peace in the Middle East, having only helped kill around 1 million people in the region. Now, some of the details released about Trump's plans for the Board of Peace seem to have taken some of its members by surprise. So Blair has distanced himself from the $1 billion fee, with a spokesperson saying that the former prime minister isn't involved in determining the board's membership. Israel has also pushed back, saying that some of those invited, which include Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, were, quote, not coordinated with Israel and were contrary to its policy. Of course, one group has been entirely left off the guest list, with not a single Palestinian in sight. Of course, on the ground, Palestinians in Gaza continue to be corralled in a small part of the strip. You can see that the red zone there. That's a continually shrinking area that makes up just over 40% of the total area of Gaza. Is demarcated by the yellow line, recently described by an Israeli general as Israel's new border. Palestinians are routinely killed for crossing it since October's ceasefire came into force. 450 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. 100 of them were children. So that's one child killed per day under Israeli so-called peace. Ash, let's talk about this Board for Peace. So it's an interesting concept. I mean, I also find it interesting, the idea that you can get a permanent seat on it, because Donald Trump, of course, is only going to be president for another 3 years. But if you give someone $1 billion, it's unclear who gets the $1 billion. Does it go to the board? Does it go to Does it go to Donald Trump? Does it go to... No one really knows. Then you can be a permanent member of this parallel United Nations, which you can buy your way onto, which gets to oversee various war-torn territories.
Okay, so here's what it's really about. It may surprise viewers to learn it's not actually about peace. It's certainly not about geopolitical stability. I think the fact that you have so many people who've made their money in essentially real estate, property development, and a particularly aggressive approach to property and to real estate, that tells you everything you kind of need to know. So if you buy your way onto this board, I think the idea is, and you start, positioning yourself as a peace board, so sort of brokering ends to conflict, where it's presumably it'll be the weaker party who's asking for the intervention of these, powerful nations. That the quid pro quo is sweetheart deals on land, minerals, fossil fuels, property development, opening up markets, etc., etc. So I think you should view this as a kind of real estate gangsterism. So combining the sort of military and geopolitical heft of these countries with what I would imagine to be deeply personal, oligarchic, economic interests, and it's almost like the boundaries between one's personal enrichment and being a head of government or being a head of state are completely dissolved, I think, in this view of the world. You're there so that you personally can get something out of it, or your friends can, in particular industries and particular corporations. So yeah, that's essentially what I think it's about. It's a sort of board by which they are able to snap up distressed assets. And so war has always been a means of profit for particular companies, weapons companies, speculators, so on and so forth. But now this is a way for states to get in on the action without actually having to have the good graces to invade a country anymore. They can just wait till one country invades another country and then pounce on the carcass.
There's lots of elements of Donald Trump, and especially his second presidency, which seems to hark back to older, more sort of explicit formal forms of imperialism. So sort of this constant desire. I mean, Greenland's obviously the most obvious example, which is that he's trying to expand his territory by purchasing land or invading land and getting resources with it. The kind of thing that hasn't been talked about for many a decade, since the Second World War. This reminds me a bit more of, say, something like the East India Company. So sort of you can buy your way onto it, and then this body, which doesn't really have any kind of legitimacy based on sovereign nation states sort of agreeing to it. It's completely separate from any international organization, and rich people can buy their way onto it and control territory, which is very similar to the East India Company. Of course, they had a more sophisticated idea of what kind of trade they were going to be doing, but it's a similar form of the kind of colonialism we had a couple of centuries ago.
I think that's true. I think that there's also another way to look at how Trump sees his own role, which is something a little bit like a Roman an emperor who wants to leave the boundaries of his territory expanded by the time he leaves office. Maybe not because he's been democratically removed, but because the good Lord said it was his time. And so I think that, when you look at, say, Trump and Kushner, for instance, there are shades of like an imperial family. So yeah, I think that there are much older forms of imperialism which are embodied by the Trump doctrine. This board resembling the East India Company is one of them. But then I also think that sort of centrality of an imperial family, the role of personal enrichment in statecraft as well, and also his attitude towards territorial expansion. I mean, that's even older than the East India Company, I would argue.
I mean, I suppose the Romans did that, didn't they? The Mongols, the idea of expanding territory, much older than the East India Company. That's probably as old as soon after the agricultural revolution, people started building empires, didn't they?